good morning and afternoon or evening. I'm Kareem. I am the new program coordinator for the Connecting Business Initiative. I'm really happy to be here with you today. And I'm taking over for Karen Smith, who I know many of you already know very well, but I will be working closely with her and the rest of the team to ensure a seamless transition. And I'm really looking forward to building on the successes of the last 5 years of CBI and strengthening our networks and beginning to expand and scale. We have a really interesting presentation today, so I want to be as brief as possible at the beginning so that we have as much time as we can have for discussion. As many of you know, today is the second webinar being organized by our colleagues at the SDG AI Lab for the CBI member networks. The SDG AI Lab is an initiative organized by the United Nations Development Program dedicated to supporting the achievement of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, by harnessing the potential of artificial intelligence, or AI, machine learning, and other technologies. And as you know, we've asked the SDG AI Lab to research new technologies and their potential use in humanitarian emergencies by the private sector. Today, we're going to hear an update from that team on the progress of their research. And I believe they're going to be asking you to tell them which areas they should be focusing on going forward. So we're also really looking forward to an interactive discussion and hearing from you your ideas and your input. So without further ado, let me introduce now our first sort of speaker, and it will be Mr. Gökhan Dikmener. He is the technical specialist for the UNDP Istanbul International Center for Private Sector and Development. And he's going to say a few additional words of introduction. Gökhan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Karim, and I will be very brief. First of all, I would like to thank you for participating into this second webinar. And at certain places in this webinar, you will see really interesting projects, technologies, and ideas. And when you need some technical support to implement these technologies, I would like to mention that SDG AI Lab will be ready to support in this journey, your implementation, your ideas. And I would like to give floor to my colleagues to hear more about these interesting technologies. Thank you again for this great partnership to CBI colleagues. We always appreciate this joint work. Thank you.
Thank you, Gökhan. And maybe before we hand over to Jonas, I'll just very quickly say one or two additional housekeeping items. First, we really are looking forward to an interactive discussion today, so please do use the Zoom features at the bottom of your screen. You can use the chat to enter in your questions, your comments. There should be a Q&A box as well for you to enter in any questions. When we get to the interactive portion of our meeting today, we will definitely go through all of those. So we are looking forward to your input. Jonas, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Gökhan and Karim. I think I already took control over the slides. So please, technique, don't let me down today. Okay, there we go. One less. All right, so hi everyone, I'm Jonas again. It's very nice talking to you again. I think it's 6 months now since your last session. So before I dive in, I also want to maybe just spend 1 or 2 minutes to emphasize a few things I think are very important regarding what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, I'm doing research on this topic since almost 1 year now, and professionally I work as a data scientist, and still I really acknowledge it's a very complicated topic. It's involves so many multi-layers, everything is interconnected. So we're really trying to be as practical as possible and focus on the most feasible solutions that can bring immediate contribution. So that being said, I also want to encourage once more again to please engage with us after this presentation. I think this time we allocated more time for the discussion. Then I also really want to encourage you to take a look at the report, because everything I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to talk fast, I think, is covered in much more detail and very well explained in the report. And the last item is I really want to encourage you to reach out to us, and so we can engage in more individual talks and guide you a little bit better, like what is possible and what's not, and look at the individual needs of every network. Okay, so now to dive in. First of all, I want to take a little quick recap to the last webinar we had, I think 6 months ago. And we basically postulated 3 questions last time. First one was what technologies are promising for our context, what are the major use cases those technologies are applied to, and what is the role of the private sector networks in this whole big picture and scheme of things. So last time we already asked you what technologies you're using in your work. As you can see there are some items which are more prevalent than others, like social media, GIS, and cloud computing. So while doing my research, it was actually surprising and interesting to see that when I tried to rank technologies to the opportunities they can have to our needs, so we have immediate opportunities, next year opportunities, and upcoming opportunities, so things that have high potential but maybe take some time and more resources. Most of the technologies you mentioned are actually part of the ones I also classified as immediate opportunities. And those are AI, crowdsourcing, cloud computing, GIS methods and systems, social media, and communication networks, including mobile phones and 5G. So some of them may be a little bit surprising to you, but we can also discuss about that a little bit more later, I think. So to just give you a little bit more context, like how I derived to this categorization, I was looking mainly at 5 things. It's the prevalence, how much successful, and that's the important word, use cases do we have for this technology? What's the maturity? Is it more prototype or already in use? The simplicity, how complex is it? The potential, what is the potential impact it can have on disaster management? And affordability, so how expensive it is to just use it. So in total, those are the highest ranked ones, but I don't want to spend too much time for the theory details because it's in the report. So the second question is the major use cases. And this was a little bit more difficult because I really tried to group together 100 of different descriptions and items here, and I came up with 8 different use cases. So we have situational awareness and information gathering. I think this is by far the most important one. This is basically getting an overview of what is going on with the disaster. For example, having dashboards, damage and loss assessment, just assessing the damages. And looking who needs the most resources in a disaster. Then assessment, for example, predicting how likely it is that a disaster will happen. Then we have relief logistics and resource allocation. So how can we allocate resources the best? A good example is the blockchain case study from the Vanuatu network. Emergency communication, how we communicate disasters to the population. So for example, Mexico did this COVID-19 digital platform to communicate information about something which is going on to the population. Event simulations, that includes, for example, augmented reality to train people. And then we have search and rescue, which is self-explanatory, and disaster detection, for example, to detect the aftermath of earthquakes. Okay, hey, I'm sorry for the audio. Is it better like this? Yeah, okay, okay. Anyways, I mean, this was the theory part, which is also a little bit, I think, less exciting. So it's good that you can hear me now when we move to the next part. So just 2 things I want to keep you in mind is that I would say 80% of the use cases I was looking at, and it's of course a subset of everything, are basically situational awareness, damage and loss assessments, and to predict the disaster, so in the preparedness management. So we need to keep this in mind. But I want to use more time this time to talk about the role of the private sector in this whole picture. And first of all, something I want to say is, of course, it would make more sense to talk to each or about each network more individually because countries differ, the hazards differ, the available resources differ, the member networks differ. But I think there are some general takeaways which are true and prevalent throughout all networks we can focus on today, and then we can move into more detailed discussion maybe after the session. Okay, so to dive in, first of all, I think it's important to understand why we need the private sector for technology-driven disaster management, and the other side of the medal, what the private sector can gain. So we need to understand that this can be a win-win situation for all of us. Okay, so the one side is we really need to understand that most know-how, innovation, existing solutions, especially access to high-quality data, is coming from the private sector. And of course, you think about multinational companies like Facebook, Twitter, but it's also true for local companies that have access to specific data, or they can reach specific populations, or they have existing technical knowledge we can leverage. So this is very important to keep in mind. Also, sometimes the companies have a better outreach to population than public entities, so something we can leverage. And by using technologies, and you do this locally, we can increase the local ownership, which also leads to the next part, the other part of the medal, the things the private sector can gain. And for some very practical things, of course, increase skills of the staff when working with new technologies. Also, working on innovation will have spillover effects to other part of the business. Better branding, working on disaster management, using cutting-edge technologies. And I think very importantly, new partnerships, because we need partnerships to achieve those things. We're going to talk about them. And increase resilience. So by doing so, of course, we have better resilience between within the communities and countries. So this is good for healthy business. Okay. So having a better understanding of this, now we need to talk about the common challenges. And here we could spend a lot of time, but I think it's more interesting to focus on the more promising part of things, looking at some solutions. But to keep it brief, I think the main bottleneck we have in our context with the networks and the countries we're looking at are limited resources. So for example, this includes lack of funding, which is always a problem, lack of technical knowledge, lack of infrastructure. Sometimes there's just not the necessary infrastructure. So this, I think, can be tackled the best with partnerships between academia, public sector, international organizations. So it's good to be talking to you right now, I guess. And then the next most important thing is uncertainty about the digital maturity. We really need to understand what each member company can bring to the table. What is the level of, let's say, the data level? What data do we already have? What knowledge do we already have we can leverage? So I think here we should kind of trying to develop a methodology so we can do it step by step and really like outline what we have and what we need to have to achieve what we want to achieve. Then to keep it brief, data, we could talk about it for probably like 1 hour, a whole session. Data quality, data collection, access to data, we just need good data to build most digital solutions. So this is always a big challenge we need to overcome. Legal issues, this involves, for example, humanitarian data standards we need to apply when working with the data, something we need to keep in mind. Then we also need to shape the acceptance and awareness in the population when we use technologies, otherwise they won't use it. And then we have some practical considerations for our purpose, for our context. And I think actually it's the best. I'm gonna go to the next slide when talking about that. Okay, so here I made this high level overview, and of course it could be much more in detail, and it's in more detail in the report about the member networks, the most associated risks, and some promising technologies. But let's start with some practical considerations. And I think the most important thing is that we need to understand that every high-tech solution, it doesn't matter how advanced it is, simply fails if it doesn't reach the people in need. So for example, to give you a good example, I think if you look like a country like Japan and with like high-tech infrastructure and available technologies and solutions, it makes sense to think about Internet of Things and processing data real time with 5G and using AI and this and like sending the findings to the population over social media. However, in our context, I think it makes more sense to focus on things that are low-hanging fruits and that can bring immediate contribution to the networks. And to give some specific examples, and I'm very happy to talk about it in more detail after my little presentation. So for example, we can look at the African networks, Côte d'Ivoire, East Africa, Madagascar. They're dealing with a lot of droughts, high rainfalls, floods, and wildfires in Madagascar. I think it would be helpful already to have a better understanding about the situation. So we need data to do so, but how do we collect data in countries where data collection is not institutionalized? So for example, we can use drones, and I think that's obvious to just have a better understanding and collect footage. Then through partnerships, for example, with labs like us, we can process the data and then send the findings to the people in need. And I was just checking the Côte d'Ivoire network, and I was seeing that they published this update about using mobile payment for text payments. So it's actually interesting, but the mobile penetration rate in Africa is pretty high, and I think we should always try to leverage what's already there and build on top of existing resources and solutions. Then looking at other countries like Haiti, the Philippines, the Pacifics, Vanuatu, Fiji, here again, it's very, very difficult to collect high quality data because data collection is not very institutionalized. And then I think this is like a common recommendation for everything. We can use something like crowdsourcing. So we can engage the community, the people, and collecting the data. And Martin is going to talk about it in more detail with this practical consideration. This is really helpful because we're going to engage the people, so they're going to feel like part of the solution, and they are indeed part of the solution. Then we can use the data again to prototype our digital solutions. Then if we have a little bit, I would say, medium or higher technical resources already, like in countries like the Philippines, the PDRF networks in Mexico, I think it makes sense to also leverage that and work more on the skills, the digital skills, for example, working more on the machine learning and AI part and data processing. So I remember we talked with the PDRF network like a year ago about automatizing the data collection, which is done manually, like many, many times in those in those contexts. So just let's say making it a little bit easier and automatizing existing things will already bring immediate contribution. Okay, I think I'm running a little bit short on time, but maybe I can mention one more example Okay, let's look at Turkey. Turkey is dealing with a lot of earthquakes, and they have existing solutions, the Turks are, for example, using mobile phone data to track victims and just have a good understanding what is going on during the disasters. What we did in Turkey, we used social media data in our lab to have a better understanding of how people behave through COVID-19 restrictions. So to just like understand how we can shape policies. And this is also something that can be leveraged in countries where people have high usage rates of social media. So I think this is also true for many of our networks. Okay, so maybe because I'm short of time, I'm gonna give over to Martin and we can talk about more specific solutions a little bit later and engage in the bilateral talks. So thank you very much. This is pretty much it from my side, but I think we're gonna have the Mentimeter in between, right? So over to you, Nada or Karim.
Okay, I did not know that I was going to be running this Mentimeter activity, so my apologies. So everybody, let's all take a moment here, and let's pause and think. We'll take a bit of a reaction from the group by using the Mentimeter. I think you may be familiar with this. It's my first time using Mentimeter, so we'll just all go together to this website. You can do this on your phone if you are connected by your computer right now, or vice versa. And enter in the code 781-27731. And if we can get the next slide. So great. What kinds of use cases? We heard a really quick overview from Jonas about different types of use cases that may be relevant to you. So we're curious about what would be most useful to you in your disaster management operations. And feel free to select more than one. We'll give this a second to let everybody vote. So we have 6, 7 votes. It's interesting to see that so far, I mean, Jonas, correct me if I'm wrong, but it does seem like we have a clustering around some of the use cases that you identified as.
Yeah, I mean, probably I also biased our audience a little bit. And then it's a little bit difficult because, first of all, there is no methodology to define use cases. So I really try to group them together. And as you said, my introduction is very brief for the sake of time, but I'm not surprised to see that because other things, it doesn't mean that they don't have high potential. It's just like, I think for our context, it's a little bit less promising to look at that. So it's good to see that my sense was correct, or at least like hinting in the right direction.
Colleagues, thank you very much for this exercise. I think, do we have one more Mentimeter exercise before we go on to the next part? Yes, we do. So please, if you have a moment, you can just enter into that same browser window any ideas you may have on how this research can be more useful for you, for your private sector network in your country. We would love to have any of your ideas or inputs. Feel free to enter them in here now, or we can save them for the interactive part of our session. I'll give it maybe another minute or two to see if anybody is in the middle of writing something brilliant out. Well, thank you to the two brave souls who have written out their own inputs right now. And these are two great ideas to make this research report a little bit more useful. We will revisit this, I think, in the next part of our session. Oh, it looks like a few more are coming in here. So I'll give it one more minute. Go ahead, Jonas.
So just as a friendly reminder that our collaboration with CBI actually involves practical use cases. I think the third point is mentioning that. So Martin and Ken, my colleagues, they're going to talk about more practical applications. So I hope this is already a little bit tackled. and start small. I completely agree on that we need to do it step by step. Okay. Best practices, collecting data.
Oh, great. This is really helpful. Thank you to those of you who have entered in. If you are still writing something, maybe wrap it up. I don't want to lose it if we advance to the next slide, but we will continue. I mean, we're going to have an interactive discussion in just a few minutes now, but as Jonas mentioned, we would like to hear as well from Martin on some of the case studies. So over to you, Martin.
Yes, thank you very much, Karim. Thanks to Jonas and thanks to Gökhan for the introduction. I will request remote control now. And once it's granted, I can start presenting. Do I have the control? I guess so. Okay, I can see it now. Thank you. So I will give you, first of all, my name, Martin Sigeti, and I'm working for SCG AI Lab. I'm a colleague of Jonas and Gökhan, and we are collaborating with CBI on like GIS research and prototype solution workstream. And I will just mention the 5 first chapters I will go in this presentation: GIS as a technology. Then in the second part, I will talk about the data question for DRM and prototyping solutions, and also like what kind of relevance it has for the member networks. And now I clicked, and I hope it goes to the next slide. Now I click again. Okay, so just let me give a very quick explanation of what I'm talking about when I talk about GIS. So GIS is an information system, and it is designed to capture, store, manipulate, analyze, manage, and present all types of geographical data. So this is basically all it can do. And now I will give you a little bit more information on what GIS actually is, what are the core activities in GIS and GIS-related research. We can do so. First, information extraction management is key for the success of any research activity. Let's take earthquakes as an example. Without knowing the severity, location of damages, like rescue teams cannot coordinate their emergency operations efficiently. So knowing that is very important. Secondly, predictive analytics. This is the scientific part of GIS, where models are created and used to predict future events. So talking about earthquakes again, models help to understand the vulnerability of people in affected areas better. So in this way, we can focus the preemptive measures on areas with higher risk. So should start off. This is like some sort of early warning system. And then the last one is GIS is very useful to create visuals, and they help the targeted audience to understand the findings of the studies better. And maps are one of the best visual tools to understand complex phenomena. Okay, so now just also an technical overview of the GIS as technology and disaster risk management. So the general use cases, and this is also Jonas something he touched on, is like the hazard risk dimensions, vulnerability and exposure, and of course mapping those, designing early warning systems, prepared damage assessments, and all sorts of activities around the cluster preparedness, response, and recovery, and the common disaster types. And this is something Jonas mentioned as well. In the member networks of CBI, usually are so concentrated somewhere around floods, droughts, earthquakes, volcanoes, and tropical cyclones, and all of the resulting damages. So the image on the right is obviously some sort of a summary of what I just mentioned. Drone is one of the technologies to collect data. AI is one of the technologies to analyze the data. GIS as a whole gives us the results and lets us understand the context. So I will move on to some high-level example. And this is a little study, or big study actually, by Google, and they developed the flood prediction service, which uses machine learning to identify areas of land prone to flooding and alert users before the waters arrive. Some of you are probably familiar with this. And this is now covering all of India and Bangladesh, and like 200 some million people are now receiving early warning messages if floods can strike. So this is really a higher level example and a good example of collaboration of private networks. So this is a summary of the major innovations in the history of GIS, starting with the military operations of the 1960s and how digital remote sensing was invented with satellites, moving on to the first GIS softwares in the 60s and 70s, and positioning system in the 80s, and also in the 1990s, something we use every day, web mapping services like Google Maps, for example, and some interesting innovations of the 2000s, crowdsourcing. In 2004, OpenStreetMap is something I will mention later. And then, of course, drones and unmanned aerial vehicles are like the detection methods we have are much more sophisticated nowadays. And machine learning as a construct in computer science, which enables us to analyze data in a much faster way, more precise, and so on and so on. And if you talk about the 21st century, integrated GIS is the keyword here. So everything will be connected, smart cities with automated traffic, and every device will somehow know where it is in space and time. So this is something we are looking forward to. Next slide. This is the main topic. So we are talking about the prototype solution for the member networks and something interesting we are working on. So we identified that MSMEs are something really important. And we also just saw it in June, the MSME Day from CBI and the member networks. We are actually looking for opportunities to increase the resilience of those and understand the exposure of MSMEs in the network. So this is a multi-purpose prototype and also is embedded in the online format. So this is something I will explain now. So there's a problem with MSME data. As far as we understand, a lot of networks have very unlocalized or sparse data sets on the location of MSMEs. On the left side, this is an earthquake report from Turkey. And you can see that the orange dots are some of the areas where MSMEs were located or businesses in general. And on the right side, you can see like some sort of summary for the Philippines, typhoon risk and MSMEs, but we don't really know where these MSMEs are. So we just know the total number. And this is something we could improve. And now we're talking about digital collection as data collection as a technology. So what kind of ways would we have to actually capture the dimensions of businesses in some of the countries we are talking about? And so collecting data helps us to understand where these businesses are and also other critical infrastructure. And one of the sources is crowdsourced data, which Jonas also mentioned before as one of the innovations. And also, for example, Google Maps as a proprietary data source. So we also use online volunteers. And in this example, if you look at the left image, this is collected data. We have already sampled a city in the Philippines. And you can see some of these MSMEs. And now if you walk in Google Street View, you can actually see the precise location of those and map the extent. Next slide. Yeah, click again. So what can we do with this data? So on the left side, this is an exposure map for flood depth in the Philippines. And on the right side, we can see that some of these businesses or whatever we talk about are in the red area, green area. So it means that they are like more prone to this flood risk and the intensity of the flood is higher. So this is how an output of such a study can look like. And I clicked again and it doesn't move. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Can we please go back to the slide I was just and then move on forward? We have a technical issue here. I can't control the computer anymore.
Are you still with us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Is this the next slide?
Yes, I'm asking if Nara is with us. I think it's her computer.
Yes.
Yeah, this is the next slide. So I can talk about this one. And then I say next, and we can go to the next one. So the outcomes of this endeavor would actually be something like creating exposure database. So something we really don't have right now in the member networks, as far as I'm concerned. And we also want to add additional layers for building resilience. So meaning that if we walk through Google Street View, we can task the volunteers to actually capture the building structure and the type of building. So actually, if we include this into a database, we can use this for earthquake resilience prediction, for example. So we can categorize buildings according to this. So the use cases is obviously quantifying risk of locality and MSMEs and population groups. We can use the data to feed into existing models of the member networks. For example, PDRF has models to calculate these kind of metrics, but we also have our own. It's called Climada. And then we're gonna also just conduct risk exposure mapping as an exercise itself. The benefits are like it's low in time and resource requirements, it's scalable, and we can replicate it in other countries. So this would be a big plan to gather data on these MSMEs in other countries. Next slide. This is one too much. Sorry. This is the last slide is the, or we skipped the slide. So, but I'm done. So this was just additional information on the prototype.
Thanks, Martin. I think we may be a little bit tripped up here. We have one other case study to sort of present on, and then I think we will go into our group discussion. So if you are thinking you have some good ideas, you have some questions and comments, and you don't want to forget them, please enter them into the chat. Otherwise, we thank you for your patience. We'll have another quick presentation now, and then we will have our conversation. So without further ado, I believe our next speaker is Ken. Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Karim. Hello, everyone. My name is Ken. I'm a technical lead for the natural language processing development at the SDGI lab. To begin with, what the NLP is, it is a key emerging tech that involves programming computers to process and analyze large amounts of human-readable natural language data, hence the term natural language processing. You can consider this as a crossover of multiple traditional fields of linguistics, computer science, and cognitive science. Through the deep dive workstream, the SDGI lab is creating a NLP prototype to demonstrate how this technology could further enhance our understanding of the private sector initiated disaster management. Through the next 2 slides, I will briefly introduce you the key objectives of this workstream, the expected outcome, the development process, and the interim results. The advanced analytics with the NLP is a technology that can enhance strategic planning by highlighting growth opportunities that would otherwise be hard to spot. There has been a recent case of a company that specialized in certain chemical compound that scanned all the publicly available information on such compound to identify a potentially new application. And of course, scanning all this publicly available information cannot be done by a human alone. In this similar context, the problem which has been identified by this workstream is that there is a lack of systematic way to gather information on private sector activities in regards to the disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. It is a niche market, and none other than CBI can benefit from understanding this better. Therefore, the key objective of this workstream has been set to create a data pipeline that extracts text information. The insights gained from this workstream would benefit the CBI Secretariat and its network to stay up to date in broad scope of activities in disaster management. Amongst the sorted informations, there could be lessons to be learned from practices by other private entities elsewhere. As an interim result, visualizations have been created. It is possible to view the datasets of CSR reports based on each sector as an example. Disaster management were commonly found amongst financial services, oil and gas producers, general industrials, chemicals, and constructions and materials. Deeper investigations on how these companies might be referring to disaster will be required, as they could be the case of a hazard for an individual company as opposed to a natural disaster. Along this information, it has been identified that companies, including MSMEs from Turkey, Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Mexico of the CBI network countries, had company reports with disaster reference. The prototype development in the upcoming months would involve how to investigate this further in a more systematic way. The development process will proceed to find out how companies are referring to the natural disaster keyword and what are their activities. So please stay tuned for the further updates in the upcoming months. Now I'd like to hand over the mic to my colleague.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. And I think we have been promising to get into questions and answers for a while now. So let's jump right into it. We're not, I mean, the 31 participants is a pretty large group. So we can try to do this in one of two ways. One, you can try to use the reaction buttons at the bottom of your Zoom screen to let us know if you have a question or comment. Otherwise, we can also suggest that you unmute and ask your question, or you type your question into the chat box, and then we can call on you. So any one of those mechanisms, we're happy to have it. But we are definitely hoping to hear from our member networks who are on the call. Questions, comments, feedback about the presentations we've heard. Let's maybe start there before we start thinking about what we might take out of this for our own member networks in our own countries. So anybody want to go first? Maybe while we are thinking about that and you were thinking about our questions and figuring out how to unmute in Zoom, I could ask a question, just sort of exercise my privilege as the host here. And just a question for the SDG AI Lab colleagues. I mean, what technologies do you think our member networks could most profit from in their own emergency response? Where would you suggest they focus their energy?
I think I can take this one, but can you hear me now? I want to make sure my technology is working to give more information about technologies. So I think it's not easy to answer this question within 10 seconds. And it was also not easy to give an overview about everything within 10 minutes. But the more I do research about this topic and this domain, I think there are probably 3-4 technologies I would really encourage to take a closer look at. And those are maybe a little bit surprising, but I really think crowdsourcing is very promising, because crowdsourcing is, first of all, not expensive to implement into a project. Second of all, it's not complicated to do so. You don't even need like a lot of technical knowledge, but it tackles one of the major problems, and that's data collection. And data is really the queen, as somebody already posted in the chat. And even at us, like in the AI lab, sometimes we have really good data sets. I think I spend 80% of my time just cleaning and processing data. So having a way to obtain high quality data is really, 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 really great. So I think this is an amazing thing to try out. Also because it includes the local people, like it gives them a sense to be part of the solution, which they really are. So I think it has so many promising aspects that it's something to really look into. Then I think something more, not controversial, but maybe something people wouldn't expect is cloud computing, because it's not like a big buzzword and it's not like that everybody understands what it really means, but it basically takes away the need of owning physical resources. So the only thing you need to get started on working on cutting edge AI, if you have the knowledge at least, is access to internet. And those tools become better and better, and it involves everything: storage, servers, processing power, computing power, and it just requires access to internet. So I think cloud computing is very promising as well. And then something which maybe does not have the highest impact, but because for me, it seems like a low-hanging fruit, is social media, because social media is used in basically every country. And it's just accessible data, especially when we look at platforms like Twitter. Also, I think Facebook, it's not too difficult to obtain data from Facebook when talking to them. And just in general, it contains a lot of actionable information that can help to shape the understanding of how people, well, behave in a disaster, but also to obtain critical information. So for example, what we can do is we can scrape Twitter real time and build models that extract pictures of damages, because people take pictures with their phones from their villages and upload them on Twitter. So we can use it for loss, damage and loss assessment. So I think this is also really promising, because it's just there. It's accessible and it's not too difficult to get started. And then of course, everything is related to AI and machine learning. I think this is just like something we need to recognize, that especially working with data, we're not gonna come about that. Maybe it's a little bit too difficult to jump into right like in the first second, but I think it's also something we need to keep in mind. Okay.
Thank you,
So-
Jonas. And I see that Benjamin is writing some questions into the chat. So Benjamin, if you are with us and you feel comfortable, why don't you unmute yourself and you can let the whole group know where you are calling in from and ask your questions yourself. I think everybody would love to hear another voice besides mine and
Sure.
our other speakers. Over to you, Benjamin.
Sure. Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin, calling from Madagascar. I just wrote the questions, within this, based on I just wrote the question and did not ask because I don't know whether it's relevant or not. I'm coming from the private sector. So I've been working here in Madagascar, for the deployment, thanks to someone who is an expert and deploys the 930 disaster risk management platform here for natural catastrophes. But I come from Airbus, and now today I'm working for Teleperformance and involved here with CBI in Madagascar. My first question, so I hope it's not a dumb question, and sorry for that, but what is your highest challenge, in structuring an integrated product and services? Why? Because I came out with a finding, I don't know if that's a relevant question or not, but I came out with a finding that sometimes the synergies is not being implemented due to one primary factor, a root cause analysis, is because we have not been able to gather, community interest, I don't know whether this question is relevant or not. That's the question number one. And question number two is, how do you leverage, because most of the cases I found out, I was at the head of risk management subsidiary for Airbus, and one of the key factor, for cyber security we found out is it's not due to technology, you can put whatever technology you want, it's not going to make it better, but one of the critical aspects is how do we take decision, really. And my question is, in the overall system, we have, I think, my question is, how do you leverage, disaster risk management, in natural catastrophe, thanks to the dysfunctional identified with COVID management situation? I hope I did not bother you.
Well, thank you so much for those very in detailed questions. I have to be honest, I think I'm not sure if I correctly understood the second question. So maybe if one of my colleagues have a better understanding, I can start and then I can chip in. So, thanks to this one.
I can reframe,
okay, that would be helpful.
No, I will reframe. Let's put it in that way, sometimes we don't have the fresh eyes, so in between across experts, we have taken decisions believing that there is no other way, a good decision lead to good actions, but with the COVID situation, that it has been obvious that even across the expert communities, that we did not have the same understanding and same diagnosis, and especially regarding the principle of precautions. What I'm trying to say, a lot of dysfunctional have been highlighted thanks, because I am a positive human being, thanks to the COVID situation, a lot of positive factor has been highlighted, and one of them is how do we take decision, and are the decision being taken relevant, for instance, the Harvard review had a clear diagnosis that we had to take such and such decision, whereas another scientific community had a different view. So my question is, I don't think that in natural disasters, the way we tackle it, the way we take decisions, the governance, let's say, across the stakeholders, I don't think it's different, and my question is, how do we leverage,
Maybe I can jump in here and say, I Benjamin, I really appreciate this discussion point, and it's very helpful. I think we often say that the technology is not going to make the decisions for us. It's a tool that's going to hopefully help us make better decisions. But at the end of the day, as you've sort of highlighted, the decision making, that's something that may perhaps be outside the scope of our presentation today. I think what we do want to be able to focus on is to say, how can we use new technology and new sources of data to take better decisions? And how do we empower the people on this phone call and other humanitarian responders to use that technology to make better decisions? So I think, when it comes to what the decision itself is, well, you're going to have to, at the end of the day, there's no replacement for that human judgment. Somebody's going to have to use the tool. And frankly, if your technology tool is telling you your decision, it's probably not the right kind of tool. But what we want to do here is to make sure that tools like GIS are available, that we think about the power and also the potential pitfalls of using tools like social media in an emergency, how we might get messages out, how we might conduct needs assessments, and then how we might, as responders, use those data sources and those tools to make better decisions. I mean, that's really what we want to focus in on today. And that's what we want to hopefully empower our members and our member networks to be able to do. But I think I take your point, and I think it's a very helpful point. And you know, to that point, perhaps if there are other member networks on the call, I think we'd be curious to know from you sort of what technology tools you think could be deployed in your contexts. So perhaps you're in a country that uses Facebook for everything. Perhaps you're in a country that uses Twitter for everything. Perhaps you have thought to yourselves, you know, if we had digital maps of this district in this area, we'd be able to respond better. Or maybe you've thought about some of these other kinds of technologies that we heard about today, and perhaps it would be helpful to put that list back up on the screen. We'd love to hear from you about that. And I see that 2 people have now raised their hands, which is great. So let me try and use that to call on you and go ahead and unmute yourselves. So Gokhan, I think your hand went up first, but if you'll forgive me, I'm going to start with somebody who we haven't heard from yet. Arishiana Fabienne Fali, I hope that's how you pronounce. Unmute yourself, introduce, let us know where you're calling in from, and share your feedback. Over.
Thank you very much. I'm calling from Madagascar also. I am from the National Disaster Risk Management, and we are working closely with the private sector humanitarian platform. And we used to go to the humanitarian network week in Geneva all together. And I think I attend in some of CBI meeting over there. I think as far as Madagascar concerned, let's say that we have already used a lot of technology. For example, GIS, satellite imagery. We have also begun to use drone in some ways and some aspect of the disaster risk and management. For example, in disaster management, and sometimes also in planification, including that mainstream the reduction risk management. But what I can say is one of the main challenge for us is on that way to have the capacity and to buy license. This is the first thing that limits our and one of the constraints that we face. For example, if you talk about GIS, if you want to have a very, let's say, good data, and then at the same time have something in which you can monitor and then interpret after that a disaster that is happening, you have to have a license on that. This is something that sometimes limits our activities. The second thing on that way is our capacity also to follow the new technology. Because when you talk about drone, for example, the drone, you have, we have one day used the DJI drone. But the DJI drone at the same time, if you want to have all the capacity of those drones, there is also a limitation of buying some aspect of those drones. So there is also a capability and the capacity of the institution to have the complete let's say, capacity of those technology. And the last one, I say we have used also satellite imagery, but you know, Madagascar don't have satellites. We use the support of United Nations, for example. So we have to have a kind of, let's say, standard operating procedure with UNOSAT, for example, or with European Satellite Agency to have those imagery. And this is also, there is also a limitation of image that we can have. So if I sum up this example of limitation, this is very useful, but as a developing country, there is a kind of limitation in terms of budget. We have a lot of ideas, but we have a limitation of budget as an institution. But now there is opportunity with private sector. The private sector here is very active. And then there is a kind of opportunity in which we can develop a kind of cooperation with the private sector in order to complete this gap. And I think there is enough, let's say, member of private sector humanitarian platform, let's say, to help us to try to find a kind of solution on that. This is the one thing. And the other thing is, and I will end with it, you have talked about Instagram, Facebook. This is a very, like a popular thing that Malagasy people is used, you like to use. And this is a very good thing to gather information and let's say to see instantaneously what happened in the field. But the thing is that, and the capacity that we don't have on that is to filter what is good and what is, let's say, not enough, and what can be, let's say, used in a point of situation in which every day we have to do a situation report, right? So this is the capacity in which we are also limited. But and I think there is also advice that you can share with us on those two pillars of capacity that we are already using, and there is a limitation in Madagascar from my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that very thoughtful set of comments and remarks. And I think, if you'll forgive me, I want to just sort of answer briefly and say that we're going to come back to this and provide a more detailed answer later, because I want to take advantage of the time we have left, which is only a few minutes. And I know that we have one more slide to put up, which is about next steps. But I do want to very quickly say that with regard to the licensing and capacity issues that you raised, as well as the sort of availability of data sources, I mean, you've definitely triggered a couple of good ideas for us. And I think one of them is that we, as the UN system, as UNDP and OCHA, as the Connecting Business Initiative, and also as member networks, can together approach some of these organizations, and you would be amazed what they will give you when we come in with a request like that. It's often the case that the GIS mapping companies, some of these other companies where there are major licensing issues, there are cost issues associated. When we can leverage the power of our network and our name, we might be able to get something going together. So that might be something for us to explore, as well as on the capacity. And it's definitely something for us to look into, partnerships with the government as well. I see we have 2 questions in the chat. I want to read them out instead of calling on the people who have asked them, just so that we can take advantage of Jonas, Martin, Ken, and the team. So Jonas, Martin, Ken, and the team, I think you've seen these already, but I'll just buy you a little bit of time to prepare an answer. And these will be the last questions for now. If there are additional questions we don't get to today, please do send them through and we will respond by email. And as you'll see, we'll have our next steps. We will continue this conversation. So in terms of the questions that have been asked, one is from Mi Lin. How can private sector actors be better involved? Are there spaces and institutions and initiatives in these countries in which they can contribute? And is there potentially a transferable workflow for the application of digital technology at the country or smaller scale? We also have Srijit from India, who is an online volunteer data scientist at the SDG AI Lab, asking how we validate or assess results derived from diverse sources of data. That's a huge question. So good luck answering that in 4 minutes. And I think actually those are the 2 questions that are picked up here. And how would you prioritize in case of a contradiction? So questions for the SDG AI Lab team and some final remarks from you as well. And if Nara is still with us, perhaps you can advance to the next step slides after this round of answers. Over to you.
Okay. Hey, I'm gonna jump in very quickly because I know we're running out of time. And excellent questions, really, all of them. And I'm very happy to follow up with all of you to answer those in more detail. And about Mi's question, you know, that's really one big problem and one challenge. And I think that's also one big part of the report to how can we better involve the private sector. And I think, first of all, that's why I talked about it. We need to understand that it can be a win-win situation. So we need to incentivize, of course, the private sector to be involved in technology-driven disaster management. But for your next question, if this can be a transferable workflow, I absolutely think, because let's say the root problems of identify the need and the demand and then how to tackle the demand is always kind of staying the same, right? And I actually had this little workflow slide in this presentation. It's in the annex, so I'm gonna send it to you, to how to approach this. And for the other question, if there are any spaces in those countries, grassroots organizations, there are indeed a lot of these little labs and things going on. And also there's like an honest disclaimer from my side. That's why I would really like to engage a little bit more detail with the networks to have a better understanding of the member networks and get like a list, and so we can really, really understand what is there and how we can leverage it. And the other question I'm gonna pass now, but I can write you a message afterwards to the end. So thank you very much. And then over to you, Nada, or colleagues.
Well, thank you to the SDG AI Lab team. Thank you for all of the participants who've called in from around the world. We really appreciate you being here. In terms of the next steps, because we're trying to wrap up and stay on time, we'll very quickly advance to this. We are hoping to get some more of your insights and experiences before the research report is finalized. And we'll be reaching out to each of the member networks and certainly to everybody in the room today. And we welcome your additional inputs. We welcome your ideas as well about potential pilot activities that we might follow up with and launch together in the future. If you have ideas of your own, we'd love to hear from you. If not, we may approach you with some of our ideas. And we'll be having these bilateral conversations with interested member networks by the end of the year so that we can think about how we move forward together in the following year. We will do one more round of this exact presentation for our colleagues in different time zones, and then we'll be following up with a wrap-up message to all the participants. So thank you to everybody. If you have any questions or comments that we didn't get to today, please do email us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. I want to also give an opportunity to the SDG AI Lab colleagues. And Gökhan, do you have any final remarks or final words?
Thank you. And in relation to the questions also, I would like to share 2 things. One of them was about if these technologies can be used to make better decisions. And I would like to remind or bring to your attention this Cunefin framework. Basically, what we are trying to do is trying to understand the situation, and if it is a chaotic situation, try to reduce it to a complex or complicated situation. And if we can access more information and if we can process more information, we will have more control over the situation and make better decisions. And these technologies, as you have seen from the presentation of my colleagues, are capable of actually collecting and extracting information. One technology that we presented today here can process more than 50,000 CSR reports of the private sector. This is a huge expertise support. So this cannot be done by a human effort, and the machine can summarize it for you. And likewise, the other technology through crowdsourcing can bring information about SMEs from the Street View, Google Street View, and the other technologies. So these technologies can help extract information, collect information, and help you to make better decisions. And in terms of the use of these technologies, and maybe I can use taming these technologies and making ready to use for the network, that's where the SDGI Lab is at your service. We work together with CBI, and we would like to work together with the networks and explore and experiment with these technologies and gradually integrate them to your practices. Basically, we are here to help you to mainstream these technologies, but this will happen gradually, and it will require an assessment of the networks and these technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks again to everybody who's joined us. And we look forward to continuing this conversation. Have a wonderful rest of the day and week, and take care.
Thank you so much, everyone.